deck building and playtesting my way through the base Neo format, I've come to realize that Venusaur is much more of a staple card to this format than I originally thought. This format was heavily defined by your ability to deal with energy removal. So decks that were low energy, could accelerate energy, or move energy around really stood out. This Venusaur build in particular was one that I was actually playtesting for Neo on, but it kind of worked so well that I thought I would try it out for base Neo as well, as not very many changes would have to be made. In Neo on, you wouldn't have to worry about energy removal, but you did have to worry about a higher prominence of fire types. But in base Neo, it still fares very well and has some really great coverage options that we'll get into now. Let's go ahead and dive into this deck build. When it comes to converting this deck from base Neo to Neo on, very few changes need to be made. For the Pokemon lineup, you won't have to make any changes at all because all of the base set, jungle, and fossil cards that this deck uses were reprinted in Legendary Collection, so they were legal for Neo on. So we are going with a full playset of Cleffa. Quite a bit of setup is still needed for this deck, but the way it's structured kind of moves gameplay into tiers, where you kind of have a Phase 1, a Phase 2, and then an in-game Phase 3. That's one thing I really like about this Venusaur build. So that Phase 1 is going to be using Eek off of a Cleffa to refresh your hand, getting basic Pokemon down onto the bench, and getting your first row of attackers into the active position once you're done using Cleffa to refresh your hand. So I'm going to be running 4 Bulbasaur and 3 base set Venusaur. That's where your money makers are going to be, moving that energy around, using that Solar Beam late game to Oko Sneasels or potentially 2-hit Chanseys, and then 1 copy of Promo Venusaur. That way, if you need to, you can utilize its solar power to deal with decks heavy on special conditions. Now, Promo Venusaur isn't always going to make its way into gameplay. It's going to be very situational depending on what type of deck you're up against. And then I'll be running 2 copies of Scyther. This is going to be one of your Phase 1 attackers. Promo Scyther can deal a good chunk of damage for only 2 energy, and when most players are up against a Venusaur deck, they know to go heavy on the energy removal from the get-go. They don't want to give you the ability to move around a lot of energy at once, so they're going to be hitting this Scyther with a lot of energy removal very early on. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're getting off attacks, that's great. If you're not getting off attacks, that means you're probably running your opponent out of all of their energy removals, potentially super energy removals early on, meaning that you can come in and sweep with Mewtwo as a Phase 2 attacker using energy absorption to just gobble those energy right back up out of the discard, getting them onto the field, and by that point you probably have at least 1 Venusaur, meaning that from there you can freely move those grass energy around. One of the biggest hurdles for this deck can be Steelix because it's got that grass resistance, but that is where Flareon comes in. Promo Eevee is going to let you evolve super quickly. As soon as you use a Pokemon Breeder to move into a Venusaur, you can go ahead and evolve any Eevees you have on your bench into Flareons, pulling them straight out of your deck. And this can be a way to threaten those Steelix with a weakness, as these Flareons are going to be able to attack very quickly, as well as they only require 2 of those grass energy to be moved over by Venusaur. And like I said earlier, all of these cards are legal in both base Neo and Neo on. The Black Star promos, they move over, and then Flareon and Venusaur are reprinted in Legendary Collection. For the Professor lineup, I just went with 3 Elm. Unless I'm running a speed deck, I've found that I tend to like Professor Elm a lot more. So for setup decks that are a little bit slower, I always prefer Professor Elm, but as always, you can mix and match Elm and Oak as you want. Doing a full playset of Pokemon Breeder because it is essential to getting those Venusaurs out here. I'm not running any Ivysaur in this deck. I wanted to keep room open for my coverage options in Mewtwo and Flareon, especially Mewtwo, since it does serve as kind of a backup nightly garbage run and getting those energies from the discard directly into play so you can start moving them around more. But because there are so many different types of Pokemon in this deck, Pokemon Trader is also essential. Running 3 copies of that, typically off of 1 Eek, you could get just about everything you needed, but you would still end up with maybe an extra Cleffa or 2 in your hand that you're not going to need after turn 1 or 2. So you can just Pokemon Trader that for whatever it is you actually need to get the strategy going. And if your Eeks and Elms don't get you what you need in your hand, that's where Computer Search comes into play. A couple copies of Computer Search, just because you are going to need very specific cards at very specific points in the game. Focus Band is in here for your Clefas, your Scythers, and your Eevees. That can be especially important once you've evolved into Flareon. If you're going up against the Steelix, you need all the help you can get in surviving against those tail crushes, but also for your Scythers early game to either deal those chunks of damage or allow it to survive long enough to run your opponent out of their energy removals. And although we do have some high HP Pokemon more in Mewtwo and Venusaur, this deck doesn't need Goldberry because this is a VenuCenter build. You're just going to be moving those energy off of any Pokemon that have damage on them, playing Pokemon Center, and then just moving those energy back to where they need to be in order to get off your attacks. And then for the gym, we will be using Energy Stadium, which is going to help you, again, get those energy out of your discard. At this point, it would get it into your hand. That way you could get it into play, so not as effective as Mewtwo, but still pretty useful in just getting those energy back after your opponent has discarded them. As I'm sure you've surmised from the deck list so far, one of the major points of this deck is to run your opponent out of energy removals and super energy removals as early as possible by threatening them with attacks like Scythers, where they don't want to take that chunk of damage, so it's easier to just get rid of those 2 energy. And then once the energy removal threats are out of the way, that's when you're going to utilize all of these resources to get those energy back. So you got Mewtwo, Nightly Garbage Run, Energy Stadium, and from there you just build up those energy into a VenuCenter powerhouse. Now, I need to run a full playset of Rainbow Energy in this deck for Mewtwo, and also so that Flareon can get off a Flamethrower every now and then if you're really threatened by Steel types. I'm not running any Psychic Energy in this deck, definitely no Fire Energy in this deck, and so Rainbow Energy is essential for using Energy Absorption on Mewtwo. Now, the great thing about Rainbow Energy is that when it's not being used as a Psychic Energy for Energy Absorption, it can be whatever type of energy you want, so you can turn it into a Grass Energy and move it around with Venusaur's Energy Trans ability. You do need to be careful when you're using these Rainbow Energy for Flareon's Flamethrower attack though, because you'll have to discard the Rainbow Energy off of it in order to use that attack. And those Rainbow Energy are ones that you're going to want to hang onto in your hand until you know it's safe to lay them down, because they are so versatile. You're going to be able to make threats out of Mewtwo and Flareon with them. Those are going to be more for late game when your opponent's not going to be able to discard them. Again, that's why it's so important for this deck to go ahead and get all of the energy discarding out of the way very early. Those rainbows are a huge weapon, as you can lay it down, and yeah, you have to put a damage counter on that Pokemon, but you've got Pokemon Center to help with that later on anyway. But you can transform it into a Grass Energy, move it around as you want, and then when it's attached to another Pokemon, it can then transform into any other type of energy you want. And then the rest of the deck will be filled out with 14 Grass Energy. Now you could do a couple less, but I found 14 to be just right. So if you're adjusting this deck for Neo on, all you really need to take out is Computer Search and Nightly Garbage Run. Pokemon Center was reprinted as a Black Star promo, so you don't really have to worry about that one. And Rainbow Energy was reprinted in Aquapolis as an e-reader card. Of course, you'll probably want to do substitutions with a lot of the new supporters that were introduced in the e-reader sets as well, but I'll save that for the Neo on video. Since Venusaur does have a pretty high retreat cost, same for Mewtwo, you may want to include Switch or Double Gust in this deck. The reason I didn't include it was really no matter what Pokemon you get stuck with as you're active, you can move energy onto it and attack with it. And so you're not really stuck with anything in the active position, except for maybe Cleffa, but it's got free retreat. But that's just my personal preference to make more room in the deck for different strategies. Double Gust can definitely be a great weapon in this deck. Depending on your playstyle and deck preferences, you may also want to opt for no removal gem or eco gem for this deck as well instead of Energy Stadium. That way you're more preventative in those energies being discarded instead of using Energy Stadium to just recoup your losses. But know that with Eco Gem and no removal gem, those will get countered pretty hard by other gems and replaced. At least with Energy Stadium, your opponent can benefit from that as too, so they're not as likely to replace it on the field. If having to rely on Pokemon Breeder makes you uncomfortable, or if you just feel a little safer including a couple of copies of Ivysaur in the deck, I would suggest not using the base set or legendary collection ones. Instead, use the Southern Islands Ivysaur. It has better attacks for lower energy costs, with the same amount of HP as the base set one, so this is actually just a better backup attacker for Scyther and could actually serve some use before evolving up into Venusaur. And then finally, let's talk about fire type Steelix coverage. A lot of people don't like using Flareon because Eevee is so fragile, but Eevee does evolve so quickly after being played that it doesn't really turn into gust bait very often. I know that some players prefer to use Arcanine because it's bulkier, it can hit harder, and Growlithe has much higher HP than that Eevee. However, Arcanine requires 2 fire energy to use either of its attacks, and Flareon requires no fire energy technically, and so if you use Arcanine you have to rely more heavily on your rainbow energy. So that concludes a Venusaur deck for 2 formats. I'm very close to rolling out a lot of Neo on videos, and so I thought this would be a good deck to get you guys excited for the next wave of decks that will be hitting the channel. So if you've got any request decks for base Neo or Neo on, go ahead and start throwing those down in the comments and I'll start reviewing those. If you want to find me on the socials, links to all those will be down in the doobly-doo. Thank you so much for watching, and until next video, bye!